I ran into my ex-husband and his mistress. It was during a pregnancy checkup at a women's and maternity clinic in Chicago. They humiliated me. "What are you doing here? A barren woman like you doesn't deserve to be in this place." 10 minutes later, they were in absolute shock. Just then, a doctor appeared and said, "Hello, I hope you are all in good health. Before we continue, please help this channel grow by liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment telling us where you're listening from. If you've already done that, let's begin." I always thought that someday I would walk into this clinic as a doctor, not as a patient. But that morning I chose to wear my simplest clothes, a worn-out white button-down shirt that was starting to fit loosely around my waist, black slacks, and a medical mask that covered most of my face. No white lab coat, no ID badge, no specialized medical loops. Just a three-year-old woman who, in the eyes of her ex-husband, had failed as a mother. My steps were slow as I entered the lobby of the Hope Women's and Maternity Clinic. This place should have felt like my second home, because it actually was. But today I came as a patient who wanted to know why my menstrual cycle had been irregular for several months. It wasn't out of fear. I just wanted an objective answer without my true identity interfering. I held the results of my basic preliminary lab work in my hand. My hands were a little cold, not from nervousness, but because I knew that whatever truth came to light today would open a new door in my life. The elevator chimed with a ding. The doors slid open, and the world froze. Spencer stepped out first, walking briskly with his chest slightly puffed out, just like he always did when he felt like the most important man in the room. Beside him, with their fingers intertwined, walked Chloe, wearing a forced, smug little smile. One of her hands rested on her belly, which wasn't even very visible yet, but she pressed on it purposely to make it look rounder. The same belly she constantly flaunted on social media, the belly she used as the ultimate excuse to destroy my marriage. Chloe stopped dead in her tracks when she saw me. Then, as if she had a script memorized in her head, she dropped the line she had been dying to throw in my face for months. "What are you doing here, Sophia?" Her voice was loud, piercing, and deliberate, designed so that the other patients around us would hear. She took a step forward and lifted her chin. The hand holding her belly shifted to her hip as if to highlight her new status even more. "A barren woman like you," she repeated, slowing down to ensure every single letter pierced my ears, "doesn't deserve to be in a maternity clinic. You'll bring bad luck to the other patients." Spencer stood right beside her without saying a word, not even attempting to calm her down. He just lowered his head slightly and smirked. It was the exact same smirk he gave me back in the day every time a pregnancy test came back negative. Several patients turned their heads. Some whispered among themselves. One mother looked at me with pity. Others shot me judgmental glares, knowing absolutely nothing about my life. I took a deep breath. None of Chloe's words hurt me this time, not like they used to. In fact, I found it a little ridiculous. I looked at them both from behind my mask. My gaze was calm, flat, entirely devoid of anger. It was just a calculated coldness. When I spoke, my voice was soft but colder than steel. "We'll see who really deserves to be here." Chloe let out a loud scoff. Spencer looked away. I was about to keep walking when a veteran triage nurse walked past us. She caught my eye and her expression immediately softened into one of deep respect, but I gave her a subtle nod and lowered my gaze, silently asking her to pretend she didn't know me. She understood. She always understood. I kept walking toward the gynecology wing. Behind my back, I heard Chloe say to Spencer in a hushed voice but loud enough for me to catch, "Poor thing. Still hoping to have a baby when her uterus is so obviously broken." I paused for a fraction of a second, not because her words stung, but because the irony of the situation was almost comical. I was in all likelihood the person who had treated the highest number of problematic uteruses in this entire facility. Suddenly, a voice over the reception intercom announced, "Mrs. Vance, please proceed to Dr. Miller's office." I turned my head slightly. Spencer and Chloe looked confused. "Wow, she's seeing Dr. Miller too," Chloe whispered, completely unaware that her voice carried. I didn't say anything. I just walked slowly down the long corridor, passing by the educational posters on fertility that I had designed myself. Posters that they were probably reading without having a clue who created them. The hallway felt colder than usual. The bright white fluorescent lights illuminated the polished floors. The echo of patients' footsteps resonated around me. The antiseptic smell mixed with the faint, sweet perfumes of expectant mothers. At the end of the hall, the door to Dr. Anthony Miller's office was slightly ajar, as a nurse was going in and out with patient files. I stopped in front of the door. The nurse gave me a subtle nod, the kind of acknowledgement only those who knew who I really was would understand. I walked in. Dr. Miller's office was as impeccably organized as always, with soft lighting and the scent of peppermint he loved so much. On the bookshelf behind his desk, several prestigious medical awards were perfectly aligned. A thick file sat on his desk. I had barely sat down when there was a soft knock on the door. "Doctor." Miller walked in with a warm expression like a father reassuring his daughter. However, today there was something different in his eyes, a mixture of gravity and deep respect. He sat down, opened the file, and then spoke in a deliberately loud tone so that the people lingering outside the door could hear. "Mrs. Vance," he paused as an attending specialist and the majority board director of this clinic. That sentence struck the air like a lightning bolt in a silent room. I remained quiet. Spencer, who had conveniently wandered past the office, stopped dead, right outside the door. I could see the shadow of his body through the gap. Chloe, who was in the waiting area just steps away, whipped her head around immediately. Dr. Miller continued, his voice firmer now. "I believe it is time you knew the real results of your tests, as well as your husband's." My hands relaxed in my lap. I nodded slowly. In the reflection of a small mirror on the edge of his desk, I saw Spencer standing rigid, his hand gripping the doorframe like a man who just realized he had been living a lie he couldn't even comprehend. "Doctor." Miller opened the first folder. I could hear my own heartbeat, not out of fear of the results, but because I knew this was the beginning of the end. And just as the doctor was about to explain, a sound came from outside. It was the sound of Spencer's hitched breath trapped on the threshold. It felt as though my entire past, the humiliations, the slander, the rejection, the emotional wounds was gearing up to change course. The office door was still slightly cracked open because the nurse had been moving charts, and that tiny gap became a window for Spencer to hear something he had never imagined during our life together. "Doctor." Miller adjusted his glasses and looked at me with a body language only someone who had known my integrity for years could decipher. There was an air of caution about him, not because he was afraid someone outside was listening, but because he knew that once this truth was spoken, my life and the lives of those who had degraded me would never be the same again. "Mrs. Vance," he said in a low but crystal clear voice, "I have reviewed all your results again, as well as the ones we ran on your husband a few months ago." I nodded slightly, showing no emotion, just waiting. The way a doctor waits for an objective lab value. No drama. "Doctor." Miller glanced toward the door. I knew he was fully aware someone was eavesdropping, but he let it happen. He opened the first file, the one with my name on it. "First of all," he said, turning the results page toward me, "your overall health is perfectly normal. Your hormones are balanced, your ovarian reserve is excellent. The latest ultrasound shows no structural abnormalities, and all your fertility indicators are well within healthy, optimal ranges." A wave of warmth spread through my chest, not out of surprise because I had known this for a long time, but because hearing it spoken aloud in this room in this specific context felt like a direct blow to every insult I had endured. Outside the door, I heard Spencer's breathing turn ragged. He probably couldn't believe his ears. Chloe, who was sitting not too far away, had stood up and was peering over. Her face was tense. "Doctor." Miller opened the second file, the one with Spencer's name printed clearly on the cover. He looked at me first, then spoke in a much firmer tone, still purposely keeping his volume up. "As for Mr. Spencer's results." He took a deep breath and shook his head slowly. "I think he needs to hear this clearly." Without any sugarcoating, Spencer finally pushed the door open a bit more, making his full body visible. He tried to act as though he was just casually walking by, but his panicked expression gave him away entirely. "Mr. Spencer, doctor," Miller said politely, yet offering no route of escape. "Please come in. I see you were already listening from the hallway." Spencer froze. Chloe stared at him, her jaw dropping from the waiting room. Her mouth hung open, unable to process how her perfect morning script had completely flipped. I turned my head toward Spencer. "Come in, Spencer." My voice was soft but sharp. "It's better if you hear everything, not just pieces of it." He walked in with stiff robotic steps and sat in the chair next to mine, keeping his distance as if I were a hazardous object. Dr. Miller opened Spencer's lab sheet. His voice was unwavering. "In the gentleman's results, we observed several highly concerning parameters. A severely low sperm count, poor motility, and multiple morphology indicators that fail to meet normal standards. In medical terms, this is what we call severe male factor infertility." Spencer raised his voice immediately, the knee-jerk reaction of a cornered animal. "That's a mistake, Doc. I'm healthy. It's impossible for me to have a problem." His voice trembled. He swallowed hard and then forced out his ultimate flawed defense. The proof is that my current partner is pregnant. Chloe, who had been spying the whole time, barged into the room and immediately stood next to Spencer. She cradled her belly protectively and lifted her chin. Yes, doctor, I am the proof. Her smile was dripping with cynicism. So it's pretty clear the problem isn't Spencer. It's her. She pointed a manicured finger right at me. I simply looked at her with pure indifference. Doctor, Miller sighed, looking between the two of them. Well, about that. I also just reviewed the results from Miss Chloe's checkup. Chloe's smug expression instantly cracked. Spencer looked at the doctor, confused and visibly uncomfortable. Doctor, Miller turned the ultrasound monitor so the three of us could see it. The gestational age shown on this ultrasound does not match the date of the last intimate encounter Miss Chloe provided to the intake nurse. Chloe flinched. What do you mean, doctor? We are talking about a discrepancy of several weeks. Far too large to be considered a simple calculation error. Dr. Miller's tone offered no comfort. Furthermore, there is a medical history of a chronic infection that was only resolved a few months ago. Medically speaking, it is highly improbable to reconcile all these timelines without total transparency. The air in the room seemed to turn into solid ice. Spencer looked at me as if he had just realized a horrifying possibility that he himself had been suppressing. Maybe I wasn't the barren one. Maybe I wasn't the one to blame. Maybe all his cruel insults toward me were just projections of his own deep-seated inadequacies. Chloe forced a bitter, shaky smile. Doctor, maybe I just got the dates wrong. That wouldn't be possible, ma'am. Dr. Miller interrupted gently but firmly. If the date of conception is wrong, why does the onset of your first symptoms not align either? Why are your HCG levels fluctuating erratically? Why does your medical chart show a pattern that simply does not correspond to a healthy standard? Pregnancy. Spencer looked like all the blood had been drained from his face. Chloe grew more aggressive, trying to bulldoze her way out of the corner. So what? Are you calling me a liar? Dr. Miller didn't answer, but his steady gaze said enough. I leaned back in my chair, watching them both without saying a word, without defending myself. They weren't worth my defense anymore. Just then, my cell phone chimed. A text from Emily. Sophia, the board of directors meeting is tomorrow. Should we invite Mr. Spencer as a surprise guest? I smiled slightly. Spencer caught that smile, and his body tensed up his instincts, finally warning him that a massive storm was brewing. I stood up slowly and looked Spencer dead in the eyes. All this time you've been humiliating me. My voice was soft, but it sliced through the air like a scalpel. And yet you knew absolutely nothing about me. Not about my body, not about my work, not about my life. Spencer let out a nervous, breathless laugh. Right. What was there to know? You were just a simple housewife, Sophia. I stared at him for a long, heavy moment. Then I replied, in a low voice devoid of emotion or anger. That lack of emotion was precisely what made my words lethal. We'll see how long you can keep up that lie. Spencer swallowed hard. Chloe was dead silent. Doctor. Miller closed his eyes for a second, as if bracing himself for the hurricane that was about to hit them, a hurricane they had entirely brought upon themselves. When I walked out of that office, every pair of eyes followed me. They weren't looks of pity or disdain anymore. They were the looks of people who were beginning to realize, however vaguely, that the woman they had just seen being humiliated was not just an ordinary patient. I walked down the hallway with measured steps, not out of weakness, but because I was containing something far greater than anger or sadness, something called the truth, a truth I had let sleep peacefully for a long time, just to protect the fragile ego of a man who didn't even try to respect me. The clinic corridor seemed longer than usual. The fluorescent lights gleamed against the polished linoleum floors. The soft squeak of a wheelchair echoed nearby. The hum of patients talking faded into the background. In my mind, fragments of the past were resurfacing one after another. It all started a few months ago when I decided to get a scientific answer about my own body. I remember that day perfectly. I didn't do it at this clinic. I went to a different facility in the suburbs where no one knew me as the owner or the top fertility specialist. Just as Sophia, a regular patient wanting a workup. Back then, I sat in a waiting room looking at the long list of infertility diagnostics, comprehensive hormone panels, transvaginal ultrasounds, reproductive health screenings, and, naturally, a semen analysis for my partner. Spencer complained bitterly when I asked him to come with me for the test. If you want to get tested, go do it yourself, Sophia. Why do I have to go? It's obvious you're the one with the broken equipment. I only smiled at the time. a smile that held back a long lecture on how infertility factors can come from either partner. But I knew it was useless trying to educate someone who preferred passing judgment over listening. Eventually, whether out of sheer annoyance or just wanting to get it over with, Spencer accompanied me wearing an expression like I was forcing him to serve a prison sentence. A few days later, the results came in. I sat across from an older physician who worked at that clinic. He didn't know my identity. He didn't know I ordered these exact same panels every single day. He didn't know I was a board-certified reproductive endocrinologist. He just thought I was a woman desperate for a baby. "Mrs. Vance," he had said, looking over my chart. "Overall, your health is stellar. There are no significant structural or hormonal anomalies." I nodded slowly. Then the doctor opened Spencer's file. His tone shifted entirely. "As for Mr. Spencer, several parameters are critically low: the count, the motility, and the morphology. His condition is highly unfavorable for conception. In fact, it is quite severe." I still remember how that doctor looked at me, like he was preparing to be the shoulder to cry on for a wife who just found out her husband was sterile. He didn't know. I wasn't the kind of woman who broke down in public. I simply laced my fingers together, let out a soft sigh, and replied, "Understood, doctor. Thank you." He looked baffled by my composure. If I hadn't been who I was, maybe I would have collapsed that day. If I weren't a doctor, maybe I would have internalized the blame. If I wasn't Sophia, the woman who had built an empire with her bare hands, I might have given up. But I just slipped the folder into my designer tote bag, walked out into the Chicago afternoon sun, and thought to myself in the parking lot, should I tell Spencer? The answer came instantly. No, because I know exactly how he'll react. And sure enough, when he picked up his own copy of the results from the front desk a few days later, his attitude worsened. In the driveway of our house, he slammed his car door and said without even looking at me, "Well, how did your tests come back? Your uterus is messed up, right? No wonder we can't have kids." In that moment, I just stared at his back. He hadn't even opened his own envelope yet. He hadn't read the reality that it was him all along. And while I was the perfectly healthy one, a few nights later, he came home late, smelling of a cheap perfume I didn't recognize. His demeanor changed. He became more arrogant, more distant, more cruel. It was the first time I truly felt something snap in our marriage. And yet I stayed quiet. I endured it. I buried the truth deep down, not out of fear, but because I wanted to give him one last chance to be honest with himself. A chance he spectacularly threw away. The clinic hallway I was walking down now felt quieter as the flashback faded from my mind. I finally stopped by a vending machine near the waiting room. I needed some water to clear my head. As I slipped a dollar bill into the slot, I heard rapid footsteps approaching. Footsteps I knew well, heavy with impatience and bruised ego. Sophia Spencer called out, his voice thick and strained. I turned around. His face was ashen. His lips were literally trembling. What was all that garbage in there? He tried to raise his voice to sound intimidating, but he just sounded out of breath. "Why did that doctor say you were a board director, a specialist? You've been lying to me." I retrieved the bottle of water from the machine and twisted the cap off slowly. "Spencer," I said smoothly but with icy precision, "there are a lot of things you don't know about my life." Spencer's face flushed deep red with a mix of rage and humiliation. "Why did you hide your identity? What do you think I am? Some kind of joke? Why did you pretend to be some average run-of-the-mill wife?" I stared at him. I looked at the man who had once stood at an altar and promised to love me for better or worse, but who only ever loved the version of me he could control. My answer came slowly, every word acting like a precision strike to the center of his ego. Because I wanted to be loved without titles, without a massive bank account, without leverage. I took a sip of water. Turns out I grossly overestimated your capacity to do that. Spencer ground his teeth. "You think you can win like this?" Humiliating me in front of some doctor, I gave him a half smile. "This is just the appetizer." Spencer froze. Before he could retort, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Chloe. I could see the notification light up the screen. "Babe, the doctor says something is really wrong with my labs." "What did he tell you? I'm scared." Spencer read the text and looked back up at me. This time there wasn't just anger in his eyes. There was pure, unadulterated terror. The fear of a man realizing the ground was crumbling beneath his feet. "See you tomorrow," I said, brushing past him. "As it happens, there's a very important board meeting. I'm sure you'll want to be there." I could feel his body go rigid as I walked by. For the first time in his life, Spencer realized he was up against someone whose power and influence vastly exceeded anything he could have ever comprehended. I didn't need to scream or threaten him or return his insults. The truth was moving all on its own, and that was more than enough to make him shake. The gynecology waiting room was packed, but a suffocating silence had fallen over the area. Patients were absorbed in their own worlds, rubbing their bellies, looking at lab printouts, murmuring to their partners. But the atmosphere right around me was electric. You could cut the tension with a scalpel. Spencer was still standing in the hallway, looking like a man who had just been hit by a freight train from 3 different directions. Chloe, sitting in the waiting area, was shifting nervously, clutching her stomach and checking her phone obsessively. Every few seconds, she would dart a look at me, then quickly look away as if terrified of catching my eye. I couldn't care less. I had already given them way too much real estate in my life. A medical assistant called Chloe's name for a follow-up ultrasound consultation. She stood up, fixed her hair defensively, and looked at Spencer for backup, as if the drywall of the clinic could somehow prop up her web of lies. 5 minutes later, Chloe practically stumbled out. Her face was chalk white, her eyes wide with panic, and the printout of the ultrasound was dangling limply from her fingertips. I knew that look. I had seen it on dozens of patients, but never on someone as historically arrogant as Chloe. She didn't even dare approach Spencer. She knew whatever was on that paper could bury the pride she had been parading around. Shortly after, a nurse knocked on Dr. Miller's door. "Doctor, the next patients are ready." "Doctor." Miller invited Spencer, Chloe, and myself to sit back down in his office. The room suddenly felt claustrophobic. The peppermint scent, usually soothing now, felt sharp and clinical. He sat down heavily, placing both medical charts in front of him. "There are a few things we need to clarify," he said smoothly, but with absolute authority. "And it's best we are all in the same room for this." Spencer gulped. Chloe gripped her stomach even tighter. "Doctor." Miller opened the first file, Spencer's. "Let's begin with Mr. Spencer's results. The parameters for count, motility, and morphology of your reproductive cells are drastically below baseline limits. Medically speaking, this is severe male factor infertility." Spencer instantly went on the defensive again. "That is a lie," he barked. "I'm healthy, Doc. You guys are forging lab results. We do not falsify clinical data, sir." Dr. Miller fired back firmly. "And these are not new results. This is from the diagnostic workup you had done months ago at an affiliate lab, while Dr. Vance was still legally your wife." Chloe's head snapped toward Spencer, her eyes bulging. "Months ago, Spencer. You took a fertility test." Her voice was shaking. Spencer looked away, panic fully taking over his features. Dr. Miller then opened the second file, the results of Chloe's physical exam and the ultrasound she had just completed. "Now, regarding Miss Chloe." The room went dead silent. You couldn't even hear the nurses walking outside. Dr. Miller swiveled the monitor toward them. The black and white imaging was cold and undeniable. The gestational age indicated here fundamentally contradicts the date of conception you reported at triage. Chloe sat up bolt straight. Maybe my math was just off. Doctor, it's not just the math." Dr. Miller's tone sharpened. "The quantitative HCG hormone levels we drew this morning are highly erratic, unstable. For a viable pregnancy at this stage, the beta levels should be doubling consistently." Chloe's jaw dropped. Absolute panic set in. "It's because I'm stressed, doctor. I've been walking a lot today." "Doctor," Miller slowly shook his head. He looked at them with the exhausted gaze of a physician who had caught too many patients in a lie. "We also noted a history of a chronic pelvic infection in your chart, a condition that makes natural conception significantly more difficult, requiring much more time than the timeline you've provided." Spencer's skin turned a sickly gray. Chloe started speaking a mile a minute. "Doctor, I am really pregnant. I took a test. It was positive. Positive, do you hear me?" Dr. Miller interlaced his fingers on the desk. "Over-the-counter urine tests can yield false positives, yes." "Are you calling me a liar?" Chloe practically shrieked. Spencer reached out to grab her arm. "Chloe, stop it. People are gonna hear us." Chloe violently yanked her arm away. Her eyes were welling up with tears born of the very panic she had orchestrated. "I'm pregnant, Spencer. I'm carrying your baby. Are you just gonna abandon me?" Spencer was speechless. The man who had built his entire reality on a foundation of flattery and gaslighting had suddenly lost his footing. He looked fragile, pathetic even. "Doctor." Miller closed both folders with a definitive snap. "I am not accusing anyone," he said calmly. "I am merely presenting the objective, empirical medical findings." He then looked over at me. His gaze held a wealth of unspoken support. And as an attending specialist and the majority board director of this facility, Dr. Vance has every right to know the full truth regarding this clinical case. Chloe stared at me in horror. Spencer was frozen solid like a man who finally realized he had spent years trying to shrink a woman who was light years out of his league. I took a deep breath, and when I spoke, I didn't raise my voice a single decibel. That control made my words cut deeper. All this time, the two of you have been screaming from the rooftops that I was the barren one. But neither of you ever bothered to open your eyes to the facts. Spencer clenched his fists on his knees. Sophia, don't start with your mind games. I don't play games, I interrupted smoothly. Medical truth speaks for itself. And tomorrow another truth is going to follow it. Chloe shrank back in her chair. Tomorrow. What happens tomorrow? I sighed, looking at them one by one. Tomorrow there is a very important executive board meeting upstairs. If you want to find out who truly doesn't deserve to step foot in a maternity clinic, I mimicked Chloe's mocking tone from the lobby perfectly. All you have to do is show up. Spencer went rigid. He knew that tone. It was the warning tone of a woman who didn't need to shout to absolutely destroy him. Chloe grabbed Spencer's arm, hissing in a panic. Spencer, what is she going to do? Why is she saying that Spencer said nothing? For the first time since I met him, he was completely out of words. I stood up, grabbed my designer bag, adjusted my mask, and gave Dr. Miller a brief nod. Thank you, Anthony. He inclined his head respectfully. As I walked out the door, the figures of Spencer and Chloe were left far behind, even though they were still physically sitting in that room. Because today, for the very first time in their lives, they realized they had messed with the one person they never ever should have touched. I walked toward the elevators with a steady stride. Even though the heavy tension from the office still clung to the air, the smell of antiseptic was now mixing with the rich aroma of drip coffee from the ground floor cafeteria. But nothing was as satisfying as the memory of Chloe's face when Dr. Miller told her the gestational age didn't add up. Not because I cared about her fake pregnancy, but because, for the first time, their faces mirrored the exact same anxiety they had intentionally inflicted on me for years. The elevator chimed. When the doors slid open, Emily stepped out, carrying a stack of thick legal folders. She froze when she saw me in my civilian clothes. You're not wearing your lab coat, Doctor. Vance, she murmured, her voice laced with caution. Is everything all right? I nodded, putting a finger to my lips to signal her not to mention my title. She got it. She always got it. We exchanged a knowing, silent glance. Tomorrow morning's board meeting is fully prepped, she whispered, handing me a sleek black folder. And our surprise guest has been added to the security clearance list. There was a tiny, sharp smile playing on her lips, not arrogant but deeply satisfied that karma was finally clocking in for a shift. I took the folder without opening it. I would open it tomorrow on my own turf. As I started walking again, I heard frantic footsteps rushing up behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Sophia, Spencer yelled out. His voice sounded desperate, like a man trying to stop a boulder from rolling off a cliff. I stopped. Spencer caught up, stopping a few feet away. His face had completely lost its smug superiority. Sweat was beading at his temples. He was breathing heavily. Chloe trailed a step behind him, clutching her stomach with a look of pure dread. Wait, Spencer swallowed hard, his voice cracking. So this was your big plan, huh? He pointed back toward Dr. Miller's office. You set a trap for me. And for Chloe, I turned my head slightly, looking at him out of the corner of my eye. Spencer, I never set a trap for anyone, I said quietly. I just came in for a routine checkup as a patient. You two did all the rest yourselves. His face flushed a deeper shade of red, not from anger this time, but from sheer embarrassment. And, whatever that doctor said about my labs, it's a lie. I don't buy it. I turned fully to face him. Chloe visibly flinched as I stepped closer, as if I were carrying a live grenade. I wasn't carrying anything. It was their own lies that were detonating. I spoke in a low, razor-sharp voice, measuring every syllable. Tell me, Spencer. When was the last time you actually asked me how my body was doing? Spencer stopped breathing. I kept going. When was the last time you even glanced at the test results I brought home? When was the last time you viewed yourself as my partner in this process, rather than a judge handing down a sentence from a pedestal? Spencer opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Chloe took a half-step forward. Her shrill voice pierced the air. This is all your fault, Sophia. You're just jealous. You're jealous because I'm carrying Spencer's baby, and you're just— I shot her a look so lethal it physically silenced her mid-sentence. Chloe, I said, my voice silky but freezing cold. You just heard the doctor. Your HCG levels are a mess. The gestational age doesn't add up. And you have medical documentation of a recently treated pelvic infection. Her face drained of color. I took one step closer, dropping my voice to a whisper. So let me ask you, whose baby are you actually carrying? Chloe's mouth fell open. She held her breath, like she was drowning. Spencer whipped his head away, looking like he couldn't stomach hearing that question out loud. I just miscalculated my cycle dates, Chloe stammered. No, sweetie, I interrupted gently. Your dates aren't what's wrong. What's wrong is your audacity to slander someone you thought was weak. Chloe took a shaky breath, trying to rally. You're just jealous. You're envious of me. You. I shook my head slowly. I don't envy a lie, Chloe. I'm just waiting for the truth to finish bubbling to the surface. Then I delivered the line that made both of them physically recoil. And tomorrow you're going to learn a truth much, much bigger than a few lab results. Spencer jolted. What do you mean, Sophia? Stop being so dramatic. I didn't answer. I just checked the sleek watch on my wrist. It was late afternoon. I needed to head home. I walked past them. Just as I was a few steps away, my phone vibrated in my bag. An email notification from the clinic's corporate legal department. All legal documentation regarding majority shareholder equity is prepared for tomorrow's presentation. I put my phone away without a reaction, but Spencer saw the icy glint in my eye and his shoulders slumped. He knew tomorrow was going to be a bloodbath. I stepped into the elevator, and as the stainless steel doors slowly slid shut, I caught one final glimpse through the gap. Chloe was clutching her stomach, looking down at the floor. Spencer was standing completely still, like a man who had just watched his entire future evaporate in a single morning. Meanwhile, I only had one thought on my mind. Tomorrow would be the day they finally understood exactly who they had called a barren woman. Dr. Sophia Vance, the specialist, the expert, the owner, and someone who never had to play dirty. I just let the truth speak for itself. A truth that had only just begun to surface. The sky over Chicago the next morning was crystal clear, almost aggressively bright. It was a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere in my chest, and the impending doom waiting in the 8th floor executive boardroom for a tiny storm named Spencer. I arrived early wearing a perfectly tailored white lab coat over a sharp navy suit, not to show off but to claim my actual space. For the first time in years, I wasn't hiding. I was no longer the simple, unassuming wife who had nothing. Emily greeted me at the frosted glass doors of the conference room. Are you ready, Dr. Vance? She whispered. I smiled faintly. I always have been. She nodded and pulled the heavy glass door open for me. The boardroom was impeccably set. A massive dark mahogany table, rows of sleek laptops, bottles of sparkling water, and leather-bound agendas. The board of directors was already seated. Several senior physicians gave me respectful nods as I walked past. The head chair was in the center, the seat I had never officially occupied during my marriage, but which legally and practically belonged to me. Marcus was already sitting to its right. He wore a dark tailored suit, his face calm but intensely sharp. His eyes tracked my entrance, and he offered a warm, subtle smile. Not out of pity, but deep respect. He gave a microscopic nod as if to say, "Take your throne." I sat in the head chair, and for some reason it felt perfect, like a place that had been holding its breath, waiting for my return. A few minutes later, the double doors opened. Spencer walked in like a guy showing up for a multi-million-dollar pitch he desperately needed to land. He was wearing a brand new dress shirt, his hair styled, radiating cheap cologne. He strutted in with absolute unearned confidence. He had no idea he was walking into a slaughterhouse. He locked eyes with me, and his confident stride immediately faltered. I could practically see the gears grinding in his head as he processed my white lab coat, my seat at the head of the mahogany table. The executives nodding at me, and the screaming alarm bells in his own subconscious. Sophia, he said, trying to force a smile, though his face looked like it was made of wax. You work here. What department? I didn't answer. Emily stood up and tapped the microphone in front of her. All right, let us call this meeting to order. For the benefit of the new guest joining us today, allow me to introduce the executive leadership of this facility. Spencer immediately lifted his chin, trying to regain his composure. He genuinely thought he was about to be introduced as a corporate partner for his insurance brokerage. First and foremost, Emily said, her voice echoing clearly across the room. Seated at the center, Dr. Sophia Vance, board-certified OB, GYN leading fertility specialist, majority shareholder, and one of the primary founders of the Hope Women's and Maternity Clinic. Spencer turned to stone. I actually heard the breath get knocked out of his lungs. In the next second, his face, which had radiated nothing but arrogant superiority for years, went completely hollow and sickly pale. Marcus simply watched him like a man observing the finale of a movie he had predicted in the first 5 minutes. One of the senior medical directors chimed in. She is the finest reproductive endocrinologist we have. Without her capital and expertise, this clinic wouldn't be half the institution it is today. Spencer looked around wildly, as if searching for a hidden camera before his eyes snapped back to me. Sophia, what is all this? You're a doctor, a specialist, a board director. You've been lying to me for years. I looked at him with absolute indifference. I never lied, I replied calmly. You just never asked. And I never felt the need to explain my life to someone who was only ever interested in himself. Spencer's face flushed crimson. But you lived so simply. Being humble isn't the same as being broke, I said, my tone low but sharp enough to make a few executives around the table hide a smirk. Spencer fell silent. Completely, utterly silent, like a man who just realized he had been married to a stranger the entire time. Emily smoothly steered the meeting back on track, treating Spencer's existential crisis like a minor technical glitch. First item on the agenda, the development of the new suburban branch presented by Dr. Vance and Mr. Marcus Hayes. I pressed a button on the console. The massive 8.5-inch monitor flickered to life, displaying the title slide of the project I had been secretly funding and designing. But before I could speak, Spencer forcefully stood up, planting his hands on the table. I want to speak. I'm a prospective partner for this clinic. I was invited here to discuss a corporate collaboration. The executives exchanged bewildered glances. Marcus raised a single, sharp eyebrow. A collaboration? What collaboration? Spencer smiled awkwardly, sweating profusely. Emily mentioned a partnership opportunity with my insurance firm earlier this week. A clinic rep contacted me. Emily stood up again. Excuse me, Mr. Spencer, she said, her tone perfectly polite but lined with razor wire. There seems to be a misunderstanding. We did invite you, yes, but not to discuss a corporate partnership. Spencer froze. Then, what for? The boardroom fell dead silent. Emily looked at me, giving me the floor. I nodded, slowly, took a breath, and spoke. You were invited here so you could hear directly from the board that this institution will never collaborate with someone embroiled in public scandals, verbal abuse, and an active affair involving one of our outpatient clients. Spencer recoiled as if he'd been struck. What are you talking about? His voice cracked. I looked him dead in the eye without a shred of anger. That lack of emotion made him look incredibly small. Spencer, your affair with an active patient of ours isn't just a personal failing. It is a massive liability that taints the reputation of this healthcare facility. And I will not allow my clinic's name to be used to legitimize a man who lacks basic ethical boundaries. Spencer looked frantically at the other directors. Panic was radiating off him. He could feel every single person in the room judging him. It's a lie, he shouted. You're only listening to her, my crazy ex-wife. She's a... He stopped himself just in time, realizing he was in the absolute worst room in the city to throw a temper tantrum. Marcus leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. His voice was low but lethal. I strongly suggest you watch your mouth. Not here. And certainly not in front of physicians who know a hell of a lot more than you do. Spencer ground his teeth together, furious but entirely powerless. I leaned back in my leather chair, casually spinning a sleek silver pen between my fingers. Spencer, you weren't invited here as a business partner. You were invited so you could physically see that every single door you thought was about to open for you has just been permanently deadbolted. Spencer gasped, his eyes red with fury and profound shame. I won't accept this. It's not a matter of whether you accept it or not, Emily interrupted cleanly. It is a finalized corporate decision. The meeting resumed. Spencer just stood there like a trespasser. There was no chair for him. There was no place for him. He was officially excised from everything that mattered in that room. And just as he finally turned to shuffle out the door, Marcus dropped one final quiet sentence that hit him like a sniper round. Next time, try respecting the woman you're so quick to underestimate. Spencer walked out, his posture completely broken. But I knew this was just the opening act of his downfall. I just looked back at the presentation screen, burying the storm in my chest. No arrogance. No gloating. Just pure, calculated calm. Because the real finale was still coming. The meeting went on for hours, but Spencer's agonizing reality was going to last a lifetime. Today he walked out of a room he would never be allowed back into. The 8th floor boardroom was still humming with the rustle of papers, the clacking of laptop keys, and low murmurs among the executives. But to me, all that noise felt muffled, overshadowed by one glaring reality: Spencer was still lingering out in the hallway. I could see him through the glass partition. His eyes were bloodshot, his chest heaving desperately, trying to project strength over his crippling humiliation. But he couldn't hide anything from the people in this building anymore. Not after the truth he had willfully ignored for years exploded right in his face. When the presentation for the new branch finally wrapped up, I closed my laptop and took a sip of water. The vibe was professional and routine, the exact opposite of the chaotic panic radiating from Spencer outside. I eventually walked out. He was waiting, trembling but trying to look dignified. "Sophia," his voice was raspy. "Can we talk? Privately?" I didn't even turn to face him fully. I just adjusted my files and said coolly, "We have nothing left to talk about." Spencer stepped closer, blocking my path. "You humiliated me in front of the entire board. What do you think I am?" Marcus, who had just walked out behind me, stopped. There was a cold, unyielding glint in his eyes, the look of a man who backed down to absolutely no one. "Mr. Spencer," Marcus said, his tone polite, but drawing a hard line in the sand. "It is highly unprofessional to harass an executive after a board meeting. This is a corporate environment, not your personal reality show." Spencer spun around, glaring at Marcus. "And who the hell are you to get involved?" "Huh, her lawyer, her boyfriend, some investor. All of the above if the situation requires it," Marcus replied flawlessly, not missing a beat. "But primarily, I'm someone who respects Dr. Vance as a colleague and a human being." Spencer's bravado shattered. He was completely cornered by a simple, brutal fact: nobody in this building was on his side. Emily stepped out next, holding a clipboard. "All right," she said, cutting through the tension. "Before you go, Mr. Spencer, I need to formally communicate the board's official mandate regarding your status with Hope Clinic." Spencer tensed. Everyone in the hallway seemed to pause. "In light of the documented reports regarding your inappropriate involvement with an active outpatient, your history of verbal hostility toward our majority shareholder, and the glaring conflict of interest," Emily looked him dead in the eye. "Any and all vendor collaborations, partnership proposals, or physical access to this facility under your name are permanently revoked, effective immediately." Spencer stumbled back a half step. "You can't do that." "We just did," Emily replied flatly. "The board has spoken." Spencer whipped his head back to me, his eyes burning. "So this was all you, right? You orchestrated this to make me look like a fool. You tanked my business deals because you're trying to get revenge." I looked at him directly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't get defensive. But there was an immovable gravity to my words. "Spencer," I whispered, stepping slightly closer. "I didn't have to destroy anything. You did all the demolition yourself. Every single thing happening to you right now is just the bill arriving for your own choices." His face crumbled. His lips actually quivered. "But I only did it because I thought you were just a normal wife. That you." He choked on his own words. "You never saw me," I replied softly. "Not even when I was standing right in front of you every single day." Spencer swallowed hard. "Sophia, we can fix this. I can fix this. We can go back. You still love me, right?" I stared at him for one long second. 1,000 memories flashed behind my eyes. The nights I cried alone in the bathroom. The days he mocked my body. His cruel jabs, Chloe's smug face, the cheap perfume on his collar. And finally that morning, he smirked while I sobbed over another negative pregnancy test. The answer was effortless. "No," I said, with absolute clarity. "Not even a fraction of a percent." Spencer physically shook. Suddenly the elevator chimed, and Chloe burst out looking frantic. I have no idea how she bluffed her way up to the executive floor. "Spencer, you're taking forever, She stopped dead when she saw the crowd, the executives and me standing at the center of it all in my tailored white coat. Just then, the attending physician who had examined Chloe earlier stepped off the adjacent elevator, spotting her. "Miss Chloe, good, you're still here. Your stat lab results came back. We need to discuss your dropping HCG levels and the high probability of Chloe turned the color of ash." All the executives went completely silent. Spencer stared at Chloe. Chloe stared at Spencer. Her hidden panic morphed into sheer, unadulterated terror. I adjusted the lapel of my coat, ensuring my embroidered name badge was perfectly straight. "I'm done for the day," I announced to the room. "Please proceed with the afternoon agenda without me. Emily." The executives actually parted to make way for me, a subtle gesture of deep respect. Marcus caught my eye and gave a single nod, silently broadcasting, "I've got your back, always." I walked toward the elevators. Just as I passed Spencer, he yelled out, one last desperate time, "You can't just leave me like this, Sophia. If you try to ruin my reputation, I stopped, but I didn't turn around. "If you even think about slandering me," I said, my voice echoing off the tile, "I have the medical charts, the audit logs, and a mountain of empirical evidence that will obliterate whatever fairy tale you try to spin." Spencer slumped against the wall. The words medical charts were the final nail in the coffin of his manufactured courage. I kept walking. The elevator doors slid open. Marcus held the door with one hand before I stepped in. "Doctor," he said softly, "you were magnificent today." I looked up at him. There was something profound in his eyes. Genuine sincerity. Not cheap pity, but true recognition of my worth. "I just let the facts speak for themselves," I replied. The elevator doors closed, and as I descended, I knew one thing for certain. Today I had permanently closed the door on a man who never bothered to see my true value. And tomorrow, the real reckoning would begin the courtroom. The place where the absolute truth would stand on the record, impossible for anyone to tear down. The day of the divorce hearing arrived with heavy, overcast Chicago skies, as if even the weather knew something was about to come crashing down. I stood outside the Daly Center courthouse, wearing the most neutral outfit I owned. A crisp white blouse, a sharp black pencil skirt, my hair pulled back in a sleek chignon. No flashy jewelry, just Sophia, the woman who had finally chosen to stand up and defend herself. Spencer was already pacing near the security checkpoint, clutching a battered manila folder, looking visibly stressed. Chloe was sitting on a stone bench nearby. She looked utterly deflated, stripped of the heavy, glamorous makeup she usually plastered on for her Instagram stories. The belly she had proudly pushed out yesterday was entirely flat today. I noticed her hand resting over her stomach, more like a nervous tick to hide her shame than a maternal gesture to protect anything. As I approached, Spencer called out, "Sophia, we can still settle this outside of court, right?" Amicably, I didn't stop. I didn't speed up. I didn't slow down. I just walked right past him through the metal detectors. Behind me, his voice echoed, dripping with desperation. "Sophia, are you listening to me?" I didn't even blink. The courtroom was freezing, filled with harsh fluorescent lighting and uncomfortable wooden benches. But the tension in the room was sharper than the AC. The judge sat high at the bench, posture rigid. The court reporter's fingers hovered over the steno machine. I took my seat at the petitioner's table with my high-powered corporate attorney, though honestly, with the evidence I had, I barely needed him. At the respondent's table, Spencer sat twitching nervously. Chloe chose a seat in the very back row of the gallery, sinking low to hide her face from the sparse crowd. The proceedings began. Spencer's attorney stood up, projecting a forced theatrical confidence. "Your Honor," he began, "my client wishes to establish that the breakdown of this marriage was not due to infidelity, but rather because the petitioner was cold, chronically obsessed with her career, and medically incapable of providing him with a family." The judge looked over at me. I sat perfectly still, my expression utterly blank. Spencer's lawyer pushed on. "We are also petitioning the court to award my client the vast majority of the marital assets, and substantial alimony as he was the primary emotional and financial pillar of this household." I almost laughed out loud. It was our turn. My attorney stood up casually, opening a massive, meticulously tabbed binder. No theatrics. No yelling. Just cold, hard facts. "Your Honor, we have several pieces of entered evidence that directly contradict opposing counsel's claims. First, regarding the defamatory assertion that my client is barren." He pulled out a stack of documents. "These are the certified laboratory results, gynecological scans, and comprehensive endocrine panels for Dr. Sophia Vance, all of which confirm her reproductive health is optimal." He handed the packet to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. The judge skimmed the top pages. His eyebrows shot up. "The next exhibit," my lawyer continued, his voice monotone and deadly, "contains the certified medical records of Mr. Spencer conducted at an affiliate diagnostic center months ago. These records definitively prove that the severe infertility factor resided entirely with the respondent." Spencer's lawyer jumped out of his chair. "Objection. Those aren't valid. She probably forced him into taking those tests under duress. The judge banged his gavel sharply. Overruled. Sit down, counselor, and wait your turn. The courtroom fell dead silent again. My attorney didn't miss a beat. Furthermore, Your Honor, we have entered Exhibit C, definitive proof of marital misconduct. Text messages, geotagged photographs, and hotel receipts from a weekend in Milwaukee confirming the respondent's ongoing affair with a third party. All data has been authenticated by an independent forensic IT firm. Spencer's voice cracked from his table. That's a lie. It's just Mr. Spencer, the judge barked, his patience instantly vaporizing. If you cannot control your outbursts, you will be held in contempt and removed from my courtroom. Spencer clamped his mouth shut, turning white. My attorney closed his binder. And finally, Your Honor, we have subpoenaed the attending physician who personally evaluated both parties, Dr. Anthony Miller. Dr. Miller walked through the swinging wooden doors wearing his pristine white coat. He moved with a quiet elegance, turning the courtroom into his own clinical stage. He was sworn in, took the stand, and spoke into the microphone with absolute authority. The diagnostic imaging and serology I performed on Dr. Vance indicate a remarkably healthy fertility profile. Conversely, the panels drawn from Mr. Spencer reveal severely compromised cellular parameters that fall drastically below the threshold for natural conception. Spencer buried his head in his hands. His shoulders were physically shaking. In the back row, Chloe covered her face with her purse. The judge nodded vigorously, taking notes. You can't cross-examine biology. Then came the dissection of the infidelity. The court displays lit up with Spencer and Chloe's text history. The audio transcripts were read into the record. Photos of them dining out the hotel charges in Milwaukee. Then, a devastating voicemail Chloe had left. Spencer was played aloud for the entire court. Just wait until she gives up, Spence. Half her money will be yours. We're gonna live like royalty after this. The courtroom temperature felt like it dropped 10 degrees. Spencer's own attorney rubbed his temples, visibly humiliated that his client had handed the opposing side a loaded gun. Chloe was sobbing silently in the back. And Spencer, the man who used to mock me every morning for being a broken wife, was slumped in his chair like an inmate waiting for the lethal injection. I looked at him, not with hatred but with absolute nothingness. The sheer magnitude of the truth made the concept of revenge feel incredibly small. Finally, the judge delivered the ruling. Given the irrefutable evidence of marital misconduct, documented emotional abuse regarding fertility, and the medical records corroborating the petitioner's claims, this court grants the petition for dissolution of marriage. Spencer squeezed his eyes shut, but the judge wasn't done. Regarding the division of assets, the court denies the respondent's request for alimony in its entirety, finding his claims of financial support to be entirely fraudulent. The petitioner shall retain full ownership of her corporate shares and the primary residence. And finally, any defamatory claims entered into the public record regarding the petitioner's fertility are hereby stricken as demonstrably false. Spencer looked up at the ceiling as if waiting for God to intervene. God was busy. Bang! Court is adjourned. I stood up and took a massive deep breath. I didn't feel a rush of victory. I just felt light, like I had finally unbuckled a lead weight I had been carrying in silence for years. When I walked out of the courthouse, the brisk Chicago wind hit my face. The city skyline looked brighter, the streets wider. My attorney shook my hand and headed to his car. Dr. Miller patted me on the shoulder and said simply, "Congratulations, Dr. Vance." The truth stood on the right side of the room today. I nodded. My eyes watered for a fraction of a second. Not out of sadness, but out of pure, unfiltered relief. As I walked down the massive stone steps, I saw someone waiting near the plaza. Marcus. He was wearing a simple button-down shirt. No flashy sports car, no attempt to show off. He was just looking at me in a way Spencer never had in all our years together. With profound admiration. Not like I was a prize to be won, but a person to be respected. "Can I take you to lunch?" His voice was easy, entirely pressure-free. I looked at him for a long moment. It suddenly hit me how radically different it felt to be seen by a man who didn't measure a woman's worth by the state of her uterus. I nodded slowly. "I'd like that." Marcus smiled. He didn't try to grab my hand. He didn't demand my attention. He just fell into step beside me as if to silently say, "You aren't alone, but I know you don't need me to hold you up." Behind us, the heavy courthouse doors swung open. Spencer stumbled out. His face was hollow, his gait unsteady. Chloe was right behind him, crying hysterically, pulling at his jacket, screaming his name. But Spencer just stood frozen at the top of the steps, staring at me from a distance. No rage, no threats, no blaming me. Just entirely catastrophically defeated. And for the first time, I didn't feel like the one who had been left behind. I was the one walking away with my dignity intact, the truth in my hands, and an entirely new life waiting just down the street. A few months after the gavel fell, my life felt like a dark room that had just been fitted with massive floor-to-ceiling windows. Bright, expansive, and filled with fresh air, I hadn't been able to breathe in years. I went back to work, fully embracing my identity, not as the wife forced to live in the shadows, but as the brilliant physician who stood firmly on her own expertise. That morning, I walked into Hope Clinic with a brisk, confident stride. The gold plaque on my door finally read Dr. Sophia Vance, board-certified OB, GYN Chief of Reproductive Endocrinology. The nursing staff greeted me with bright smiles, not out of fear of my title, but because they knew I treated every single patient with the exact same empathy I always had, even back when my own heart was quietly bleeding. Now the bleeding had stopped. Only the scar tissue and the drive remained. My schedule that day was packed to the minute: 4 infertility consults, 1 minor laparoscopic surgery, a department head meeting, and then the launch evaluation of a brand new initiative we were rolling out. This initiative had been my passion project for years, a comprehensive clinical program designed to educate couples on fertility, actively dismantling the toxic stigma that instantly blamed the woman. I had just finished a consultation with a young couple when Emily knocked and stepped into my office holding an iPad. "Dr. Vance," she said, her voice glowing with pride, "the new fertility education program you spearheaded. The enrollment numbers are off the charts. The patient feedback has been incredible. So many women are saying they finally feel seen." I smiled. Not out of ego, but for those women who were finally brave enough to walk through our doors looking for answers, no longer carrying the crushing weight of societal blame all by themselves. "Thank you, Emily," I replied. "Let's keep the momentum going." She nodded and slipped out. A second after the door clicked shut, there was another soft knock. Marcus walked in, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee from the artisanal cafe down the street. "I heard the chief of endocrinology hasn't had time to eat breakfast," he said lightly. I laughed. I didn't realize my eating habits were a topic of board-level concern. He set the cups down on my desk. "It's not corporate concern," he said, with that signature subtle smile. "It's more about making sure someone I deeply admire doesn't pass out in the middle of a grand rounds presentation." I paused. In my past life, a comment like that from Spencer would have been laced with manipulation, a way to assert control disguised as care. But with Marcus, it was entirely different. There was no pressure, no hidden agenda, no "I know what's best for you." Just quiet, genuine support. "Thank you," I finally said softly. Marcus sat down in the leather chair opposite my desk, glancing at the open project binders. "The regional expansion meeting is next week. You ready?" I nodded firmly. Ready. And this time, I'm showing up exactly as I am. Marcus held my gaze. His eyes were incredibly steady. "That is the absolute best thing you've ever done, Sophia." A comfortable, warm silence settled between us. Before either of us could add to it, my office phone buzzed and my charge nurse practically burst through the door looking frazzled. "Dr. Vance, I am so sorry to interrupt, but there's someone in the main lobby demanding to see you." I frowned. "An angry patient." The nurse slowly shook her head, her voice dropping to a whisper. "No, doctor. But you really need to see this for yourself." Marcus and I exchanged a look. We walked out of my office and headed toward the glass-walled atrium overlooking the lobby. From the balcony, I spotted 2 figures standing near the reception desk. 2 people who once told me I was a curse to this exact building. Spencer and Chloe. I slowed my pace. Not out of anxiety, but out of sheer bewilderment that they had the audacity to show their faces here after the trial. Spencer looked entirely unrecognizable. His hair was greasy and unkempt, his face hollowed out and pale. His eyes were bloodshot, complete with dark bruised bags underneath, like he hadn't slept a full night in months. He wasn't wearing his tailored Italian suits anymore, just a wrinkled polo shirt and a faded jacket. Next to him, Chloe stood staring blankly at the floor. Her stomach was perfectly flat. There was no baby. There was no arrogant glow of victory. She was just the ghost of a woman who had crashed her own life into a brick wall. When they spotted me descending the sweeping staircase, Spencer took a few eager steps forward. He stopped abruptly when Marcus smoothly stepped down right beside me, placing himself slightly between us, not touching me but physically claiming the space as a protector. Spencer lowered his voice, sounding entirely broken. "Sophia. I'm so sorry." There was a heavy pause. The bustling noise of the Chicago clinic seemed to mute itself. All I could hear was Spencer's ragged, pathetic breathing. I messed up. I was so stupid. I didn't realize what I had until I burned it all to the ground. I looked at him. No hatred. No anger. Just a massive, unbridgeable canyon of distance between us. Chloe finally lifted her head. Her voice cracked instantly. "Sophia, about the pregnancy." I gently raised my hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "You don't need to explain anything to me." They both looked stunned. "I am long past the phase of my life where either of you had the power to hurt me," I said, my voice smooth, quiet, and completely unshakable. "You are just a part of my past now. Not a wound. Not an enemy. Just history." A single tear spilled over Spencer's lower lash line. The tears of a man who finally realized what it meant to lose a woman whose value couldn't be bought, manipulated, or intimidated. I continued shifting into my absolute professional clinical tone. "If you are here seeking medical assistance, please sign in at the front desk. This clinic provides care to anyone who needs it without discrimination." Spencer nodded rapidly, as if that clinical courtesy was the last shred of grace keeping him alive. But then, I delivered the final blow. "But if you came here looking to reclaim the woman you threw away, I'm sorry. The woman who waited around begging for her worth to be validated doesn't exist anymore." Chloe broke down into loud, ugly sobs. Spencer squeezed his eyes shut, his shoulders violently collapsing in defeat. I turned to the triage nurse. "Please assist them with intake if they wish to register. Treat them identically to any other walk-in patient." The nurse nodded. Marcus and I turned around and walked back toward the private elevators. But right before the stainless steel doors slid shut, I caught one last look at Spencer. He was staring at me with hollow, utterly destroyed eyes. The eyes of a man who knew he hadn't just lost a wealthy wife. He had lost the one person who ever truly loved him, and his only chance at being a decent human being. The doors clicked shut. Marcus looked down at me. "I am incredibly proud of how you handled that," he murmured. I offered a small, genuine smile. I just chose not to reopen a scar that's already faded. As the elevator carried us back to the executive suite, I knew in my soul that my life was hurtling toward its brightest chapter. A chapter completely scrubbed of humiliation, gaslighting, and grief. A chapter filled with warmth, humanity, and undeniable dignity. And beneath it all, a quiet realization was blooming in my chest for the first time. In a very long time, I was finally ready to open the door to someone new. Not because I needed them to complete me, but because I wanted to. A full year passed since the day I walked out of that downtown Chicago courthouse with my name cleared and my freedom secured. The world moved at a better pace, now slower, sharper, infinitely easier to breathe in. My life was no longer driven by a desperate need to prove my worth to my critics, but by the pure, unadulterated joy of building my own empire. That morning, the 8th floor boardroom was flooded with golden sunlight pouring through the massive glass windows overlooking the city skyline. Across from me, the clinic's board of directors sat attentively looking at the projector screen, displaying a single slide, the HOPE Initiative Comprehensive Fertility Education and Counseling. The program that had once been a furious scribbled outline in my personal notebook was now an official, fully funded wing of the hospital, complete with its own dedicated staff of endocrinologists, therapists, and genetic counselors. The mission was simple yet revolutionary to educate couples that fertility struggles are a shared medical journey, completely stripping away the archaic stigma that automatically points the finger at the woman. I stood at the head of the room wearing my pristine white coat. The embroidery on the left breast pocket caught the light. Dr. Sophia Vance, Chief Medical Officer and Board Director. The coat I used to hide in the back of my closet was now my daily armor. I wore it without a trace of fear, without worrying if I looked too intimidating, and without ever needing to apologize for my success. The quarterly meeting wrapped up smoothly. The directors asked insightful questions, and Marcus, who was now officially a major corporate partner and the legal architect of our clinic's regional expansion, chimed in effortlessly. His voice was steady, commanding, yet entirely respectful of my lead. We operated like a veteran surgical team, seamlessly anticipating each other's moves, even though our dynamic was only a year old. When the meeting adjourned, the executives filed out, leaving just Marcus and me in the quiet, sun-drenched room. He stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at the Chicago River. "Sophia," he said, not turning around just yet. "This initiative, it's going to alter the trajectory of thousands of families." I walked over and stood beside him, looking out at the same view. That was always the dream. Marcus turned his head to look at me. "And you are finally exactly where you were always meant to be." Our eyes met. It was a calm, mature gaze, no rushing. No frantic, anxious butterflies born of insecurity, just solid grounding peace. "Sophia," his voice dropped an octave, growing impossibly softer. "Whenever you decide you're ready, I'd like to start building a life with you. But only when you're ready. I will never rush you." The proposal was so profoundly simple, yet that was exactly what made it hit so deep. No grandiose manipulative promises. No pressure. No toxic, "you need me" undertones. Just a genuine offer and all the space in the world to breathe. I smiled softly, dropping my gaze to the floor for a fraction of a second before looking back up into his eyes. "I don't want to sprint into anything just yet," I replied honestly. "But I'm not locking that door anymore." Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes shining as if that answer was the greatest thing he had ever heard. And for some reason, my chest felt lighter than air. Later that afternoon, after scrubbing out of an emergency C-section, I walked out of the OR and let out a long, exhausted sigh of relief. The young mother, still groggy but glowing, reached out from her recovery bed and squeezed my hand with surprising strength. Her eyes were swimming in tears. "Dr. Vance." "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I honestly thought I was never going to be a mom. For 2 years, my in-laws made my life a living hell. They called me broken. They called me barren. If it wasn't for your new clinic program showing us the real medical truth, I think I would have just given up on myself." I squeezed her hand back gently. "Never let someone else's ignorance become your life sentence," I told her warmly. "Your reality is defined by the truth, not by their rumors." She nodded, tears of pure joy spilling over her cheeks. I patted her shoulder and quietly slipped out of the recovery bay. On my way to the attending physician's locker room, I paused in the main corridor. The late afternoon sun was hitting the frosted glass wall perfectly, casting a glowing reflection of our clinic's logo onto the polished floor. Hope. I stood there, staring at the logo for a long time. Suddenly, the shadow of my past flickered in my mind with crystal clarity. I remembered the exact moment Chloe pointed her manicured finger at me in the lobby and sneered. "A barren woman like you doesn't deserve to be in a maternity clinic." The irony of that memory now washed over me like a cool, refreshing breeze unable to leave even a scratch. I brought my hand up and touched the embroidered name on my chest. I didn't just deserve to be here. I built this place. I was the architect of hope for thousands of women every single year. I was the one who could truly understand their trauma, their shame, and their tears, because I had survived that exact same fire. I had become living proof that humiliation is not a final destination, that catastrophic wounds can heal flawlessly, and that a woman who has been unjustly blamed is never, ever truly defeated. I started walking again, my heels clicking confidently against the floor, stepping out of the shadows and straight into a brilliant, unwritten future. A few weeks later, at a black-tie charity gala, hosted by the clinic, Marcus stood by my side. He looked at me the way a man looks at a masterpiece he intends to protect, not a trophy he intends to cage. As the evening wound down and the jazz band played their final set, he leaned in his breath, warm against my ear. "Sophia," he whispered, "whenever you're ready to write that next chapter, I've got my pen." I turned to him, taking in his handsome, serene face, and for the first time in a decade, I wasn't afraid to step into the unknown. "I know," I said softly, my smile reaching my eyes, "and I think I'm finally ready to start writing it with you." Marcus smiled. A smile that warmed my soul without burning it down. A smile I had never ever received from anyone else in my life. That night I drove home with a heart completely at peace. Not because I had a new man in my life. Not because my traumatic past was magically erased. But because I was standing entirely on my own 2 feet, more powerful than I had ever been. From a woman who was once dragged through the mud and branded as barren, I had forged myself into a force of nature that brought life healing and fierce courage to everyone around me. I was no longer the tragic victim of my old story. I was the undisputed author of my new one. And this story. It was just getting to the good part.